we're not quite sure what happened with one of the speakers, Father Kalivas. Traffic was particularly nasty this morning, so it could just be as simple as that. I hope that's all it is. So we're going to, in the interest of time and keeping things rolling, just get started. Welcome to the conference. I hope you'll be able to stay all day tomorrow as we explore various aspects of the history of the Archdiocese as it celebrates its 100th anniversary. Especially want to remind people of the keynote address this evening. So Professor Kitcheff, it's good to have you here with us to deliver that. Buy his book. I just tell you that right now. Definitely. But we're starting out probably with one of the more, I think the issue that probably was always on our mind when you said we have to deal with these questions of governance. And so we've assembled this panel to look at various aspects of the governance of the Archdiocese from the beginnings. And they're just going to go in the order of the program, more or less, unless they've changed their mind on me. Early Byzantine Christianity and Christian-Muslim relations. He's a double recipient of Fulbright for the study of Byzantine saints. He also teaches our course on the history of the Archdiocese here, so does work in that area. Then followed will be, Father Patrick, are you still interested in going last?
Whatever you want me to do, I shall do.
Okay, well, I'm just going right in the order then. Our second speaker will be the Reverend Dr. Patrick Viscuzzo, so we're just working our way in here. He's the professor of canon law at the Antiochian House of Studies and of the Pastoral School of the Diocese of Chicago in America. He's an Orthodox canonist and a proto-presbyter of the Archdiocese. He's the author of numerous scholarly articles and 5 books. He's been the president of the Byzantine Studies Association. Welcome, Father Kalivas, of North America, and served as the member of the North American Orthodox Catholic Theological Consultation. He's spoken at a number of domestic and international venues, most notably Dumbarton Oaks Spring Symposium and the Society for the Law of the Eastern Churches, which he just returned from, which was in Belgrade this past week. Third is going to be, our speaker will be Father Alkiviadis Kalivas. He's the professor emeritus of liturgy at Holy Cross. He served for many years as its dean. He was also president of this institution. He's the author of Great Week in Pascha in the Greek Orthodox Church, Essays in Theology and Liturgy, a 5-volume collection. And I'm just going to plug what I do for a living at Holy Cross Press, and because we're busy readying his Hierotelestikon for publication early next year. While we know Father Kalivas for his teaching and writing on liturgy, he was instrumental in the development of many administrative aspects of the life of the Archdiocese, as I understand it, including such things as the formation of the Archdiocese Presbyters Council, I believe even the UPR in their earliest manifestations, things like the pension plan. So he'll be speaking third. Fourth is the very Reverend Archimandrite Bartholomew Mercado. Father Bartholomew is a graduate of Hellenic College and Holy Cross, and he did a THM here as well. In the summer of 2015, he went to Arezzo, Italy, where he began learning Italian in preparation for doctoral work at the Pontifical Oriental Institute. He completed his research and is soon expected to defend his dissertation with the title of the work, The History and Canonical Ecclesiastical Relations Between the Byzantine States of Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus. He's also our instructor in canon law, and he too is involved with the Society for the Law of the Eastern Churches, and he just came back from Belgrade as well. And then finally, Dr. Alexandros Kiru. He's professor of history and the director of the program in East European and Russian Studies at Salem State University. in Salem, Massachusetts, where he teaches on the Balkans, Byzantium, and the Ottoman Empire. Professor Cuda's many book chapters, journal articles, and review essays focus on famine relief in Axis-occupied Greece, Greek America, and Balkan diasporas, Orthodox Christianity, and the origins of international humanitarianism and war and peace in Byzantium. And I'm going to cut it off at that because it keeps going on and on and on. He's a very busy person and has many accomplishments. So I'm just going to, in the interest of time, and what we'll do, just come on up, Jim. What we're going to do is we're going to allow each speaker to give their presentation. After each presentation, we'll ask for one or two what I call clarifying questions, like, did I hear that right, kind of thing. And then, so we'll keep that part brief, move on to the next speaker, and then at the end, we'll open up the floor to a much wider discussion of the issues at hand. So thank you.
Thank you, Father Tony. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you here. And so the title of my talk is Greek Orthodox Clergy in the First 4 Decades of the 20th Century. In a letter dated July 18, 1923, the newly established Synod of the Nascent Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America announced, to quote, priests, leaders, and Christians of the Archdiocese, close quote, announced the creation of the Holy Synod of the Autonomous Archdiocese of America. After speaking of the importance for the peace and the life of the Greek community and requesting harmony between parish priests and parish boards, an entire paragraph is devoted to the ordination of clergy for these communities. The paragraph reads as follows, quote, the Holy Synod is determined that neither the Archbishop nor the bishops shall initiate ordinations on their own, but the right of this will be exercised in the future only by the Holy Synod after receiving an appropriate request from an organized community. Along with the normal canonical qualifications for ordination, the Synod considers as necessary that the candidate has a diploma from an Orthodox theological school or seminary and sufficient knowledge of the English language as useful in most encounters of outreach for any priest in any denomination in America, close quote. It's not surprising that one of the first duties of the Synod, consisting at this time of Alexander as Archbishop and the 2 local bishops, Philaditos of Chicago and Joachim of Boston, that their first item of business was to secure qualified clergy for the Greek communities of the Western Hemisphere. Yet, at the time of this letter, numerous Greek Orthodox communities already had houses of worship, already were legally incorporated within the states where they were located, and already had clergy serving the sacramental and pastoral needs of the Greek immigrant communities. In fact, the charter of the Archdiocese, adopted about 10 months earlier than this letter, lists the existence of 124 communities in the U.S. Where did the clergy serving these parishes come from? Who were they? Which bishop did they commemorate liturgically? And to which ecclesiastical body did they see themselves and their parishes tied to? In what follows, I hope to address these questions, certainly not in any great depth, but to place my responses and observations in the context of the ecclesiastical and political environment in which these Greek communities were established and operated during the first 4 decades of the 20th centuries. It is also my hope that this paper will shed a bit more light on the makeup of the clergy for Greek Orthodox communities in these decades. It's perhaps best to divide the discussion into 2 parts, the situation prior to the establishment of the Archdiocese in 1922 and the 2 decades following. As is well known, by the time of the establishment of the first ethnic Greek parishes in the early 1890s, there already was a Russian Orthodox bishop presiding over the diocese of the Aleutian Islands and Alaska, who resided in San Francisco. The seat of this diocese was relocated to San Francisco in 1905, and 2 years earlier it had been elevated to the Archdiocese of North America and Alaska. So the question remains, if clergy serving Greek Orthodox communities in the 1890s and the first decade or so of the 20th century were not, as I believe they were not, nor do I think the evidence supports it, under the jurisdiction of this Russian diocese or archdiocese, who were they under? The 2 earliest Greek communities in New York City provide an answer. In 1892, the Community of Holy Trinity received its first clergyman from the Church of Greece, the Reverend Archimandrite Ferandinos. 2 years later, a second community of Greeks in Lower Manhattan, which the New York Times described at the time as consisting of, quote, some 400 Greeks belonging to the downtown colony of that nationality, close quote, welcomed the Reverend Archimandrite Kallinikos Delvis, sent to the community directly from the Ecumenical Patriarchate. The Times specifically notes that Solon Vlasto, president of the Greek Society of New York, known as Athena, and Solon Vlasto will later become, in a couple of years, the owner and editor of the Atlantis newspaper, that he requested from the Patriarch of Constantinople a clergyman for this second establishment. The first liturgy of this second parish was celebrated on Christmas in 1894, and the Times provides a rare physical description of one of the earliest Greek Orthodox clergy in America. I quote, "The Reverend Kallinikos Delvis is a man of striking personality. He is 32 years old, of medium height, olive complexion, and a long black hair and beard. He was born in Constantinople and was educated in the Theological Seminary of Halki in that city. His voice is resonant, and he is reputed to be a preacher of great eloquence." Vlasto, interestingly, is also quoted as saying that the new community belongs to the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Some 10 years later, this bifurcation of clergy serving in America, either with the Church of Greece or the Ecumenical Patriarchate, is reflected in a stern letter from Ecumenical Patriarch Joachim III to the Church of Greece. The letter, dated January 21, 1906, deals with the canonical status of the churches in the diaspora, and especially those in North America. Patriarch Joachim stresses two issues that need to be addressed. One deals with national identity, and the second deals with the government, or the second deals with the religious affiliation of these communities. He notes that the issue of national identity is an issue for the Greek government to adjudicate. However, the issue of religious or ecclesiastical affiliation belongs to the purview of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. In particular, the Patriarch rejects the argument that is being put forward that since the majority of Greeks in America are Greek citizens, they should therefore be under the Church of Greece. Such a view, the Patriarch says, is not justified canonically, and he reprimands the Church of Greece and says, please do not honor any requests for priests for parishes in America. 2 years later, things change. As you well know, the Tomos of 1908 that was issued by the Patriarchate of Constantinople rescinds its authority over the churches in North America and places them under the Greek Orthodox Church of Greece. Much more archival research needs to be undertaken to get a sense of the number and makeup of the clergy who were serving communities between 1908 and 1918, when the Church of Greece finally is able to undertake a serious attempt at organizing the Greek communities in America and their clergy into a more traditional canonical structure. The arrival of Meletios Metaxas, Metropolitan of Athens, and his entourage in the U.S. in August 1918, and the establishment and the subsequent appointment of Bishop Alexander of Orthostolou as synodical trustee for North and South America sets the stage for the hard work of identifying and organizing clergy and the Greek communities. The clergy, which Bishop Alexander, the newly appointed synodical trustee, found in the U.S., left much to be desired. In a 1917 report to the Greek Ministry of Foreign Affairs, George Roussos, the Greek ambassador to the United States, wrote, quote, 90% of the priests come here, that is to America, for financial reasons only, using their priestly authority simply and only in order to extort Christians in providing them with remuneration and become elements of national disintegration, close quote. Roussos, again, he is the ambassador, the Greek ambassador to the U.S., blames the Holy Synod of Greece for the deplorable state of the Greek clergy in the U.S., since it's the Synod of the Church of Greece that sent unworthy priests to America, who lack a calling and, as he writes in his report, are a real stain on the clergy. In the report, Roussos estimates that there are about 120 Greek churches and upwards of 150 priests. Bishop Alexander shared similar concerns. In a report to Archbishop Meletios in the Holy Synod of the Church of Greece, dated January 1920, the first issue Bishop Alexander addresses the state of clergy in America. He notes that they have been left for years without leadership and have been negatively influenced by what he calls, quote, the liberal environment of America, close quote. Clergy have become, quote, unruly and prone to scandal, close quote, and they do as they please and carry out their duties for economic gain. Such clergy are not used to authority, and it will be a challenge to rein them in, he says. He does note, in passing, that there are a few good clergy, but they're in the minority. The years between 1918, when Bishop Alexander is appointed as synodical trustee for the Greek diaspora in America, and March 1922, when Meletios Metaxakis becomes Patriarch of Constantinople, subsequently rescinding the Tomos of 1908 and establishing the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America. Those 2+ years were filled with multiple challenges facing the fledgling organizational structure in the midst of the political turmoil in Greece. And the fact that the Greek and Turkish war was underway. The effects of this turmoil can be seen in the Greek community, where I grew up, Salt Lake City, Utah. In November 1920, in the wake of Venizelos' loss in the elections for political leadership in Greece, resulting in the return of King Constantine to power, Metaxakis was removed as Archbishop of Athens and replaced by the former Archbishop Theoklitos. The Synod of Greece moves to rescind the appointment of Bishop Alexander as synodical trustee in America and sends to the states Bishop Gerasimus Troianos as a synodical exarch of America. At the same time, in Salt Lake City, in the Greek community, a Father Christos Angelopoulos had been appointed to the Greek community in November of 1920. In early 1921, a telegram from Salt Lake City was sent to Bishop Alexander. The telegram says that the statement in the Greek newspaper, The Atlantis, that Father Angelopoulos was released from his duties in Salt Lake for political reasons, end quote, is false. On the contrary, as the statement goes on, he was released for, quote, bad behavior and because, quote, he caused lots of trouble among the members of the Greek community, close quote. The telegram concludes by saying that the community will gladly accept, quote, any priest that your holiness wishes to send, close quote. Telegram significantly is unsigned. In July of the same year, another telegram is sent from Salt Lake community. This one's signed by a certain George Fotopoulos, who identifies himself as secretary. This time, the telegram is addressed to Bishop Germanos Troianos, the newly appointed synodical exarch. And interestingly, the address on the telegram is the offices of the Atlantis. And so remember, the appointment of Troianos, he is appointed by Theoklitos, who is a strong royalist in Greece. The telegram reads, quote, Metaxakis here agitating, stop. So now we know Meletios is in the States. After he is removed from Athens, he comes to America and spends about 10 months in America. And apparently he's in Salt Lake City right now. So the wire says, quote, Meletios here agitating, stop. Unknown how long stay, stop. We fight hard. It was written in English, and so it's broken English. We fight hard hoping win, stop. Wants Father Athanasios Tsiamis visit him, but he refused, stop. Wire immediately his appointment as priest of our community, stop. Important, stop. 6 days later, the same George Fotopoulos wires Germanos again, this time in care of the Hotel Netherlands in New York City. The telegram opens with, quote, Agathangelos Dramas recommended Athanasios Tsiamis to Rodostolu, who appointed him McGill, Nevada community. So it's a very cryptic letter, but it seems like that there's a reference that these guys want Athanasios Tsiamis as their priest, but apparently he's in McGill, Nevada at this time. In response, Hieronymus sends a telegram in care of George Fotopoulos. Hieronymus identifies himself as, quote, the synodical ex-archbishop of Sparta, Hieronymus, and he writes, quote, for Reverend Athanasios Tsamis, we appoint you and we recognize you only as canonical pastor of Greek Orthodox Church of Salt Lake City, close quote. So here in the span of less than a year, you have two priests in Salt Lake, one being appointed by Alexander and one being appointed by Hieronymus, and the parish is not clear who their priest is, or maybe they are very clear. We don't have enough evidence, but to suggest exactly what they're thinking other than these three telegrams, which are in the archives of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. And so I know as many people here have worked in those archives, they're a remarkable wealth of information, not just the general archives, but if you look in the specific archives of particular parishes, because each parish has their own box in the Archdiocese, it's quite remarkable what you can find. These articles provide us with a glimpse of the challenges parish clergy, Greek communities, and Greek Orthodox Episcopal leadership faced during these tumultuous times. I think three observations are worth noting. First, the perceived or real impact of political alignments of clergy with the political situation in Greece. How's my time? I'm giving myself 20 minutes. Oh, I got 5 minutes. Okay. Second, the ecclesiological confusion in America after the removal of Metaxakis as Archbishop of Athens. And third, the interesting reference here to Agathangelos Dramas. I think this reference is to a metropolitan of Drama who was named Agathangelos. He served in Drama, northern Greece, between 1910 and 1922 as metropolitan of Drama. Alexander, before coming to America, had served as an auxiliary bishop in Xanthi in northern Greece, and also between 1915 and 1917, he was a patriarchal delegate or representative to the churches in northern Greece. So there's no doubt that, at least as I read this, that Alexander knows Bishop Metropolitan Agathangelos, which is no major surprise. But what's interesting is I think it's good evidence, and I don't think this is surprising either, good evidence that bishops overseas were being contacted for recommendations for clergy to come to the States. And this bishop overseas, Agathangelos, has no official relationship with the church in America, but I could see how he could recommend somebody for it. I want to go really quickly because I'm running out of time. Clergy after 1922. My paper, and I'll just wrap this up real quickly. From this time period, I want to focus on two observations here. From 1923 to 1930, the Synod of the Archdiocese met in 10 sessions, and in those 10 sessions, they carried out the work of the Archdiocese. Those 10 sessions and the minutes of those 10 sessions, 10 meetings, and there are probably about 4 sessions per meeting, so it's probably about 40 times that the bishops sat down in synod and did their work. We have all the minutes of those meetings, and those minutes were published by Paul Manolis about 10 years ago or so, and I've looked through those minutes, and let me summarize what I discovered just from my cursory reading of those minutes. In my examination of the minutes of the synod, I've identified 38 requests for ordinations or receptions of clergy into the Archdiocese. 17 came from laymen residing in Greek communities in the U.S. 12 were Orthodox clergy outside the U.S. seeking transfer and appointment into the Archdiocese. 5 requests came from deacons serving in Greek communities in America, and 1 request was from a layman residing in Greece. And there was one final request, interestingly, of a former Baptist minister who had joined the Episcopal Church and had now been received into the Orthodox Church, and he wanted to be recognized as a clergyman in the Orthodox Church. What I note from my cursory review of this is that that's a relatively small number. That's 8 years of work, but there's only 38 actual requests for transfers or petitions. And the relatively small number may reflect two things. First, that there were already clergy serving Greek communities prior to 1923 who continued to serve, and the second, that there were ecclesiastical authorities of other jurisdictions, other than the Synod of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, who were supplying clergy to Greek communities. I don't have time to go to this issue of other clergy appointing priests, but by 1925, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese will publish a list of canonical and uncanonical priests in America. This list was published in the newspapers, and the version that I have looked at was published in April of 1925 in the National Herald's photo magazine. And in this list, in this announcement by the Archdiocese, it lists the names of 204 clergy organized according to the 4 divisions of the Archdiocese: New York, Chicago, Boston, San Francisco. Within each of these districts or dioceses is listed the names of the canonical priests in alphabetical order. Next to their name is listed the city and state that they are assigned to, not the name of the parish, but the city and the state, so the community. And followed by a similar list of uncanonical priests. In total, there were 148 canonical priests identified with 135 parishes. 13 clergy who were noted as canonical were not serving parishes at the time. There were 56 uncanonical priests, and their communities are identified as well. In addition, at the very end of the announcement, the Archdiocese lists 12 names of clergy who were ordained by Vasilios Konvopoulos, who was a self-proclaimed bishop. He was a bishop from Chaldea under the Ecumenical Patriarchate, who came to America and established that well-known sort of royalist church up in Lowell, Massachusetts. They listed 12 names of priests that were ordained by Konvopoulos, and the synod Konvopoulos had been defrocked by the Patriarchate of Constantinople in 1924. In closing, unfortunately I had to leave out a few things, but this brief tour of clergy serving Greek communities in the U.S. during the first 4 decades of the 20th century provides a few preliminary conclusions. First, Greek communities in the U.S. were not under the Russian Church in any significant way, and they followed what I would say was a wholly different trajectory of ecclesiastical authority. It was an authority that primarily focused either on the Church of Greece or the Ecumenical Patriarchate. 2, clergy were independent contractors who simply needed some certificate of recognition that they were clergy. And that certificate of recognition was probably some form of either an episcopal appointment from some bishop or either a piece of paper showing that they were ordained. Third, a cleric's political leanings, royalist, Venizelist, to say just 2, were one of the several factors that were considered when a community would hire a clergyman. 4, the Greek diaspora in America provided economic and employment opportunities for clergy who were willing to travel to the U.S. And 5, the GOA tried its best to maintain a high level of theological training, at least as a prerequisite for ordination. I had to leave out a couple of important kind of moments in the synod's meetings where the synod actually says we shouldn't ordain that gentleman, but we will ordain him even though he doesn't have the appropriate theological education, but echikaliphoni, and he's been absolved. That they say that, literally they say it. And then the other one they say is that interesting, they ordain a layman who had been serving in a Greek Orthodox parish as a layman and a chanter who doesn't have theological education, but the justification is we'll send him to a small parish because we won't be able to find a theologian, an educated priest who will go there. Sound familiar? Sound familiar? On that I'll end. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you. Having looked at that list from 1925, it's really, really interesting, even just to look at the photographs. Today we're all worried about who wears a cassock, who doesn't. Look at those. It's even wider. So, as we said, the variety was even bigger. if anyone has a question for clarification only, and don't go, can you repeat that? For Dr. Skedros, we'll take it now. Otherwise, we'll move on to our next speaker. So like a quick yes or no, did I hear that right kind of question that you may have missed something. Yes, George. Yes, the simple answer is yes.
Look, it's isolated in a valley with no Episcopal authority anywhere, so yeah, they're good at that. Go ahead.
Okay, and though they're sitting in the back, like latecomers in church, the front pews are empty. So again, let's move on. We're going to move on historically, if you don't mind. So we're going to have Father Mercado. We're kind of working, right? Alex, I'm sorry. Because we're working kind of in a historic mind, and then we'll hear from Father Mercado about Metaxakis, so it's kind of working together.
Sure, I think I read it down, Tony, but thank you, Father. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Father and Professor Vrain, for your introduction. I would like to thank you and Dr. Jim Skedros for initiating and organizing this important and, in my view, already fascinating conference, as well as the entire supporting community of the Holy Cross School of Theology and Hellenic College. I'm very grateful for the opportunity and for the privilege to participate in this conference and to present to you the first portion of a larger research project that I have tentatively titled The 1930 Mission of Metropolitan Damaskinos, Conflict Resolution and Consolidation in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America before Athinagoras. In the interest of full disclosure, my paper today is limited to the historical foregrounding of the 1930 ecclesiastical mission to the Church in America, rather than the mission itself. The 1930 mission, supported by both the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Autocephalous Church of Greece, was undertaken by the then Metropolitan of Corinth, Damaskinos. Elevated to Archbishop of Athens and Primate of the Church of Greece in 1938, Damaskinos would in the future be most remembered and revered for his fearless Christian defiance against Hitler and the Axis occupation of Greece during the Second World War. Although our Archbishop and eventually, of course, Ecumenical Patriarch Athinagoras is rightly credited with restoring unity and bringing reconciliation to the deeply fractured and divided immigrant church in America during the decade of the 1930s, his accomplishments owed a great deal to the vision and efforts of Metropolitan Damaskinos. But again, instead of addressing Damaskinos in his historic 1930 mission to the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America, I will discuss the evolution of the problems and the eventual crisis in the church that provoked Damaskinos' mission and produced a decisive landmark development in the history of Greek Orthodoxy in America. I believe in retail, what I'm doing here is called bait and switch. And in the academy, I think it's called ongoing research. Well, allow me to begin by stating the obvious. The period of mass migration between 1890 and the early 1920s, in which nearly 500,000 Greeks emigrated from the Greek kingdom and the Ottoman Empire to America, produced the establishment of Greek immigrant communities and Greek Orthodox parishes throughout the United States, well before the establishment of a Greek Orthodox archdiocese in the New World. As we are all well aware, before the 1890s, most of the very few Orthodox churches in America were multi-ethnic in their composition and were, as a result of these circumstances, effectively pioneer, self-administering local independent parishes. Outside of native Alaskan centers in a single parish in San Francisco that accepted the jurisdictional claims of the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow, most Orthodox churches in America established by immigrants around the turn of the 20th century operated as essentially congregationalist undertakings without any unifying hierarchical structure or authority presiding over them. Put differently, These immigrant community churches were established and administered by the immigrants themselves, without the participation or presence of hierarchical leadership or governance. The great historian of Greek immigration, Theodore Salutis, described the administration of parishes in this early stage in the following way. Quote, "Each community was a democracy unto itself. It was governed by a board of trustees or directors, many of whose members were small independent businessmen, marked by that commanding proprietary air so often found in the self-made man. Authority was vested in these laymen, and many a clergyman discovered, to his astonishment, that if democracy was diverting or rewarding for his parishioners, it was not exactly so for him. Despite the shortage of qualified priests, laymen remained in unquestionable control of church administrations. In short, the process of immigration had created a landscape in which the creation of Orthodox parishes by lay people proceeded at a pace faster than the institutional church's ability to respond to such expansion. This development was especially notable and pronounced among Greeks, who constituted the largest and most widely settled Orthodox Christian immigrant group in the United States. It is noteworthy, I believe, that churches were neither the first nor for some time the most ubiquitous institution established by Greek immigration. The initial mass wave of Greek migration to the United States in the decade of the 1890s and the first years of the new century was filled by single young men and boys who arrived in America as temporary sojourners with the goal of securing earnings sufficient to lift their families from poverty when they would return to Greece. For these men, the kafenio, the coffee house, reproduced in Greek immigrant centers across the country, became the first and most important community institution. It was in the kafenio where newly arrived immigrants would congregate to obtain information for employment, for help of all kinds, and of course for emotional sustenance and familiar camaraderie in a new and strange land. However, after the turn of the century, as temporary single male sojourners began to give way to other Greek immigrants, and especially to burgeoning Greek families committed to permanent settlement in America, the institutional, cultural, and community needs of the emergent Greek American community evolved. It evolved to reflect this new reality, meaning that churches now became the centerpiece of Greek community life, organization, and identity. Although statistics actually remain in dispute, according to Dimitrios Konstantelos, in 1900 there were only 4 exclusively self-identifying Greek Orthodox churches in the United States. By 1909, the number had risen to 42. A decade later, in 1919, there were, again, according to Konstantelos, 136 Greek Orthodox parishes, and by 1929, the number of Greek Orthodox churches in America had grown to 231. Regardless of the lack of agreement among historians over precise numbers, what is clear is that for more than 40 years after the founding of the first Greek Orthodox Church in America in New Orleans in 1864, there was no active episcopal authority over the Greek immigrant churches in the United States. This condition promoted an atmosphere of confusion in the Greek American community, weak ties beyond individual parishes, and an influx of often unqualified, opportunistic, and rogue priests. Such disorder obviously benefited no one, certainly no one interested in the welfare of the Greek immigrant community, including the United States government, which in 1907 expressed its concern over this issue to Greece's ambassador in Washington, Lambros Koromilas, often identified as Dimitrios Koromilas, his brother. In the same year, a government less favorable to the Greeks, specifically the government of the Ottoman Empire, threatened punishments against the ecumenical patriarchate because of reports that Greek clergy in America were engaging in public activism against the Turkish state's persecution of its own Christians. At the same time, although Greek Orthodox Christians in the United States were under the spiritual aegis of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, they were not under the active administration of the Patriarchate. And this fact also applied, of course, to the priests serving in America. These details, however, were not relevant to the Turkish state's calculations. By virtue of its Ottoman captivity, the Patriarchate was powerless to protect itself from Turkish intimidation. And given the absence of any clear episcopal authority to control the priests in America, most of whom actually were from Greece, not Turkey, the Patriarchate was forced, under this duress, to solve the problem of the official jurisdictional status of the growing Greek Orthodox churches in America. Interjecting itself into this crisis, Russia, motivated by either a desire to come to the defense of the Patriarchate, an opportunity to improve its own imperial position through the potential expansion of its own church's influence, or perhaps both goals, rushed forward to claim that the Greek Orthodox in America were under the authority of the Church of Moscow, and that the Ecumenical Patriarchate could thus not be held responsible or accountable for the actions of the Greek American community, including its activist clergy. Russian diplomats in Constantinople appealed directly to the Ecumenical Patriarchate to accept this formula. Instead of complying with Russia's suggestion, the Patriarchate formulated its own strategy to extricate itself from its vulnerable position. It was precisely this complicated situation that led Ecumenical Patriarch Joachim III to promulgate the Tomos of March 8, 1908, which transferred the rights and responsibility of authority to administer the Greek Orthodox in America to the Autocephalous Church of Greece. Although Joachim's Tomos placed the Greek Orthodox churches in America under the jurisdiction of the Church of Greece, the Holy Synod in Athens took no action to begin the process of organizing its new territories in the United States. The Holy Synod did not elect a hierarch to be sent to America, probably in deference to the influential diplomat, Ambassador Koromilas, who opposed the appointment of a bishop to lead the Greek American community. Koromilas was convinced that such a leadership role should be invested in a secular office holder, a position which he coveted for himself. Pleas for help and decisive action from the Greek American community to the Metropolitan of Athens, Theoklitos I, were ignored. As a result of the Holy Synod's neglect, the Greek Orthodox in the United States remained without any hierarchical leadership, and their self-initiated efforts to unify parishes, centralize administration, and establish uniform rules and governance ended in failure. Theoklitos' policy of indifference ended in 1917, when he was removed from his position as Metropolitan of Athens and replaced by Meletios Metaxakis, who had established a distinguished career as a member of the Holy Synod of the Patriarchate of Jerusalem and as a bishop later in the Church of Cyprus. The fall of Theoklitos and the rise of Meletios was a byproduct of the so-called national schism in Greece. Beginning in 1915, intense conflict over how Greece should respond to the outbreak of the First World War produced a bitter fracturing of Greek politics, society, and even the state into two rival camps, one led by the pro-Allied liberal Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos, and the other led by the pro-neutralist but German sympathetic King Constantine. When under Allied and especially British pressure, Constantine was forced to abdicate in June 1917 and to surrender control of the national government to Venizelos, Theoklitos, a supporter of the royalist camp, was ousted. Meletios, a prominent ally of Venizelos, was then made primate of the Church of Greece. It benefited the very ambitious Meletios that he, like Venizelos, was a strong supporter of British imperial interests, believing that he would be rewarded in the future for his outspoken support for British supremacy in the Eastern Mediterranean. Under Meletios' leadership in July 1918, the Holy Synod of Greece resolved to organize the Greek Orthodox churches in America. In August 1918, Metropolitan Meletios himself arrived in New York to begin the implementation of his plans. He was accompanied by a small group of advisors, including one Bishop Alexander of Rodostolu. Meletios worked tirelessly to forge an organization capable of establishing unity and cohesion out of chaos through the centralization of ecclesiastical authority. Toward that goal, he installed Bishop Alexander under the title of Syndikos Epitropos to act on behalf of the Holy Synod in Athens and to move forward the integration of parishes under one authority. After nearly 3 months in the United States, Meletios departed for Greece, promising to return to establish an archdiocese in America. The hopes for a smooth transition were, however, disrupted in November 1920 when Venizelos and his Liberal Party were defeated at the polls in a national election. Once the Royalists returned to power, they purged their opposition, including Meletios, who was expelled from his leadership of the Church of Greece and replaced by his predecessor and now rival, Theoklitos. Meletios rejected his removal from power as illegitimate, and he then promptly returned to the United States to assume control of the church in America. Remaining loyal to Meletios, Bishop Alexander defied the orders of the Holy Synod in Athens to relinquish his position in America and to return to Greece. To demonstrate his continued authority, upon his return to the United States, Meletios convened the first Clergy Laity Conference of Greek Orthodox communities in America. Held in New York on September 13 through September 15, 1921, the landmark Congress marked the beginning of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America with the official incorporation of the emergent church under New York state law. 2 months later, in November 1921, the Holy Synod of Constantinople elected Meletios as ecumenical patriarch. From the Phanar, on March 1, 1922, Meletios struck back at his enemy, Theoklitos, by revoking the 1908 Tomos and transferring jurisdictional authority and administration over the Greek Orthodox in America from the Church of Greece to the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople. To complete this action, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America was canonically created and officially ratified by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and Bishop Alexander was appointed as its first archbishop. According to the patriarchal plan, the archdiocese was to be divided into 4 dioceses, namely Boston, Chicago, New York, and San Francisco. The archdiocese plan, which also established administrative regulations, procedures, and the function of future clergy laity conferences, was accepted and enthusiastically adopted at the Second Clergy Laity Congress held in New York on August 8, 1922. Despite the considerable progress it produced, the establishment of the archdiocese did not achieve its primary objective, specifically the unification of Greek Orthodox parishes and the Greek American community under one hierarchical authority. Mirroring, replicating the bitter liberal royalist divisions in Greece produced by the National Schism, Greek American society was fractured, as Dr. Skedros dramatically conveyed to us. Greek American society was fractured along corresponding lines of factionalism throughout the 1920s, as communities and parishes broke into feuding, often litigious, and sometimes even violent rival camps. By the close of the decade, of the more than 200 Greek Orthodox churches in America, only 133 parishes recognized the authority of Archbishop Alexander, while most of the remaining parishes rejected Alexander and supported royalist claimants to leadership of the church in America. Compounding these problems, Alexander's eventually heavy-handed approach against his opponents alienated even many of the supporters of the archdiocese. Rather than easing tensions, conflict intensified across Greek America with every passing year of Alexander's leadership. Meanwhile, the departure of Meletios from Constantinople for the patriarchal throne in Alexandria, and the removal again of Theoklitos from power in Athens, both taking place incidentally in the wake of the Asia Minor catastrophe. These things contributed to a significant reduction in rivalry and tension between the Patriarchate and the Church of Greece, both of which were increasingly alarmed by the urgency of the situation in America. In late 1929, in response to cries of despair from all sides, Archbishop of Athens, Chrysostomos, and Ecumenical Patriarch Photios II joined forces with both political parties in Greece, liberal and royalist, to assign now key priority to a collaborative solution to the Greek-American problem, crisis. Photios and Chrysostomos resolved to send Metropolitan Damaskinos of Corinth, one of the most capable and respected and very young hierarchs of the Church of Greece, to America as the Ecumenical Patriarch's exarch. His mission was to take over sole authority of the Archdiocese, investigate the problems plaguing the Greek Orthodox community in the United States, and submit to the Holy Synod of the Patriarchate of Constantinople an official report with recommendations to solve the crisis. The Damaskinos arrived in New York on May 20, 1930. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Again, any quick clarifying questions apart from the scorecard you probably need to know who, what, where, when, and why? Telly.
I can't, Sally, good morning, by the way. It's nice to see you. I can't speak to that definitively. Would you have some insight?
Someone, Father Cyril Haroun told me recently that they were, Father Cyril Haroun told me recently that they were actually models for within the traditional Orthodox countries as they kind of vied for nation statehood.
Yeah.
That there were clergy lady congresses in the early part of the century, and that was the first I ever heard of that because I thought it was an invention of the diaspora.
Well, thank you. This is the first I'm hearing of it.
Does anybody know?
That's something we can bring up later, everybody? We can wait. Yeah, we'll wait on that. That is an important one. My guess would have been Lambeth conferences, given the Orthodox Episcopal connections at the time. Thank you, Professor Kidu. We're kind of mixing up the order a little bit, so Father Bartholomew, I mean, I think working really well to dovetail now to hear about what was Meletios' role in the United States.
Good morning, everyone, and I would like to thank both Father Vrame and Dr. Skedros for allowing me to share just a few thoughts with you today on this. On this really magnificent topic, and I use the word magnificent because there was a question as to why I had used the term, the appellation magnificent for Metaxakis, because this is not something that one sees really in any work up until this point, but I think it's worthy of consideration for the future. But at any rate, in the annals of ecclesiastical history, several have been given, and in history in general, several have been given the high distinction of such epithets like magnificent. And this can be seen in some historical figures such as Suleiman I. We even see this with Patriarch Joachim III, who was given this title for his philanthropic contributions. And when one considers the life and ministry and the influence of Ecumenical Patriarch Meletios IV Metaxakis, one cannot help but wonder if he should be conferred such a title. And to my knowledge, there's no formal or even informal initiative advocating that such a title should be granted to him. But even in his controversiality, the topic should remain open for discussion. In truth, much has been said about the provocative figure of Meletios Metaxakis, whose ecclesiastical career spanned over several autocephalous churches, and whose actions have provoked intense deliberation and debate for the better part of the past 100 years. Nevertheless, the present paper will not aim to address the latter activities of his ecclesiastical career. Instead, this paper will endeavor to address some of the canonical elements related to his status during his turbulent tenure as Metropolitan of Athens up until his election as Ecumenical Patriarch. Likewise, a brief review of the key points regarding the establishment of the Archdiocese will also be presented. The relatively brief but tempestuous tenure of Meletios as Metropolitan of Athens began in 1918 during a period of political discord in Greece, which had already been festering for years between pro-republic and pro-royalist factions, represented by Eleftherios Venizelos and King Constantine I, respectively. Metaxakis, who was a close ally of Venizelos, was concerned with the monarchy's influence on ecclesiastical affairs, and although he did not see eye to eye with Venizelos in all matters regarding church and state relations, he was nevertheless very close with Venizelos, and his political ideology was very much in line with Venizelos. So they had a great amount of respect for one another, a tremendous amount of respect, and this was also amplified by the fact that they shared certain ideologies. In the short time as Metropolitan of Athens, Meletios had endeavored to make several reforms to the church which strengthened the independence of the church to be self-governing at the cost of the royal family, who had until then held several prerogatives. For example, in 1919, Meletios provided a new charter for the administration of the Church of Greece, in which the supreme authority in all matters within the church would be the full synod of all metropolitans, rather than just the limited number of hierarchs, the limited synod, which is a much more limited number of hierarchs. Moreover, he promulgated decrees which removed the participation of the state in the election of hierarchs. Additionally, he instituted the creation of administrative bodies at the diocesan level, which included both clergy and lay participation in the administration of ecclesiastical properties. Such actions were possible with the general approbation of Eleftherios Venizelos, since King Constantine had been forced into exile in 1917, and the king at that time, King Alexander, was more so a puppet, so to speak. He really had quite limited power. It must be noted that at the outset of Meletios' tenure as Metropolitan of Athens, he displayed sincere concern for the Greek Orthodox communities in the United States. Although the canonical jurisdiction of the communities in the U.S. properly belonged to the Ecumenical Patriarchate, in 1908, Ecumenical Patriarch Joachim III, along with the Holy and Sacred Synod, issued a tomos granting temporary conservatorship of the communities in the diaspora to the Church of Greece, with the expectation delineated in the tomos that the Church of Greece would elect a hierarch to oversee and organize the communities in America until such a time that the Ecumenical Patriarchate could resume direct jurisdiction. Just months after being elected Metropolitan of Athens, he embarked on a journey to assess the situation in the United States and to bring about some organization which had been completely lacking. He remained in the United States for 81 days, traveling throughout the country and establishing connections between the clergy, lay leaders, businessmen, American politicians, and even non-Orthodox religious leaders. With the ever-changing political atmosphere in Greece and the elections in November of 1920, however, a seismic shift would take place which would affect not only the political sphere, but the ecclesiastical sphere as well. The elections produced a result that saw Eleftherios Venizelos essentially expelled from power, and the return of King Constantine, who had been in exile up until that time. With the return of the royal family to power, King Constantine sought to eliminate ecclesiastical acts stemming from 1917, as well as his intention to depose Meletios Metaxakis. Prior to addressing the issue of Meletios Metaxakis' deposal, it helps to add some historical context concerning the ecclesiastical state of affairs in Greece at this time. On December 25th, 1916, while King Constantine was still in power, and the then Metropolitan of Athens, Theoklitos, had until that time been serving as the Metropolitan, the same Theoklitos was removed from power. He was on that date, he anathematized Eleftherios Venizelos. And after the exile of King Constantine in 1917 and the accession of his son, King Alexander, the Venizelos faction sought to exert their influence by lobbying for the deposal of Theoklitos. One of the charges against Metropolitan Theoklitos was that he had wrongfully incited an anathema against Eleftherios Venizelos. A spiritual court was held, and he was deposed by the Supreme Ecclesiastical Tribunal in October of 1917. When the royal family returned to power after the November 1920 elections, the king, through the Queen Mother who was acting as regent until his arrival, not only sought to dethrone Meletios Metaxakis, but the king sought to reinstate the deposed Theoklitos to his former position as Metropolitan of Athens by royal decree, as well as to return a number of deposed bishops to their former sees as well. In the days following the election, Metropolitan Meletios wrote to Theodore Zaimis, the Minister of Ecclesiastical Affairs and Public Education, mentioning that he was aware of the intention of the king to cancel ecclesiastical acts by royal decree without going through the normal ecclesiastical juridical channels. In his letter dated November 5th, 1920, Metaxakis states, "Inasmuch as it is not the task of the Church to examine whether this or that vuli or government exercises its power in accordance with or in disregard to the Constitution, its acts deriving its canonical power from the holy canons cannot be reproved in any other way than from the canonical point of view. But then neither the bishops who were deposed from their thrones can they canonically regain them before a proposition to this end is made by the Holy Synod, nor can ever the Metropolitan Theoklitos return to his, for the double reason that he was not only deposed from the throne as a result of a decision by the Supreme Ecclesiastical Tribunal, but also because he was degraded from the sacerdotal function, and besides, the throne is canonically filled." Moreover, in an effort to make his case directly to the royal family, Metaxakis addressed a letter dated November 12, 1920, to Her Majesty the Regent Queen Mother Olga. In his letter, he explains the canonical process of the deposition of Metropolitan Theoklitos. He furthermore emphasized how, in the 5-month period after Theoklitos' deposition, the latter offered no protest from his part to the prelates of the kingdom or to the other Orthodox churches, nor did he reserve for himself the right to appeal before a greater synod as the canons direct. In addition to the canonical argument Metaxakis makes, he attempts to impose a strong measure of guilt on the Queen Mother by invoking the recent death of her son, King Alexander, who had died just some 2 weeks prior. Specifically, he said, and I quote, "Let no one say that an anti-canonical metropolitan performed the funeral of the late King Alexander, and that your most pious majesty prayed together with an anti-canonical metropolitan for the repose of his soul." Yeah. Metaxakis' correspondence with the Queen Mother and the Minister of Ecclesiastical Affairs were of no avail, as on November 16, 1920, the Minister of Ecclesiastical Affairs announced the royal decree nullifying the depositions and suspensions of several hierarchs in 1917 and 1919, and furthermore reinstating them to their former sees. Of course, among the hierarchs was the former Metropolitan of Athens, Theoklitos, who through this royal decree had been reinstated from his defrocked state and returned to the Metropolitan throne of Athens. On the following day, November 17, 1920, a letter from Theodore Zaimis was drafted to Metaxakis, making mention of the royal decree and instructing Metaxakis to depart from the Metropolitan throne and from the residence of the Metropolitan palace, since Theoklitos had been recalled to his throne and he had been taken out of his own exile, so to speak, as he was at a monastery. In a response to Zaimis on the same day, Metaxakis addresses point by point how the actions of the royal family are contrary to canonical norms. Moreover, on the same day, he sent a letter to the Ecumenical Patriarchate asking for assistance and another letter to all of the heads of the autocephalous churches, giving a detailed account of the events that transpired and making a spirited defense of the rights of the church to govern, of the right of the church to govern herself in the face of state opposition. In one part of Metaxakis' letter to the Prokathimeni concerning the functions of ecclesiastical courts and civil courts, he states, quote, "No comparison may be made between ecclesiastical and secular courts. Nothing can annul the decision of the latter but a decree of grace. This fact is confirmed by the precedent in the attitude of the Greek government toward Theoklitos in 1905, when it refused to execute the synodal decision about the abbot Hierotheos of the monastery of Pendeli. But the church, insisting, forced the government to approve of the decision by threatening to denounce the stance of the government as an attempt to trample down the laws of the church." End quote. On the part of Metaxakis, there were a series of canonical and legal opinions compiled which supported his view. Some of these opinions were elucidated in the correspondence between Metaxakis, Zaimis, and various other hierarchs. Nevertheless, Metaxakis and those who supported his view were drawn to three main arguments from a canonical perspective. The first argument is that the royal decrees lacked competency, since the outcomes of the decisions in those decrees would have had to be made in a synodal context. This is especially true in the case of the reinstatement of defrocked persons and the restoration of hierarchs to their former sees. Metaxakis makes note that such persons must first lodge their complaints and then seek an appeal of the former decision by the competent ecclesiastical authority as per Canon 65 of Carthage and the commentary of Alexios Aristenos on the same canon. The second argument stems from the canonical principle that deposed persons who have not been reinstated in the proper manner are still considered deposed. Therefore, those who serve with those deposed persons should themselves be deposed. This principle is upheld in Canons 4 of Antioch and 11 of the Holy Apostles. And their third argument concerns the uncanonical practice of deposed persons attempting to seek recourse through civil authorities, namely imperial or royal authorities. This is addressed in Canon 12 of Antioch. Despite these canonical arguments, it was clear that the outcome would favor the prevailing powers. This culminated in the retreat of Meletios Metaxakis from his position in Athens, instead traveling to the United States, hoping to continue organizing the communities there. He arrived in America in February of 1921, where he greeted Bishop Alexander Dimoglu of Rodostolu, who had remained in the United States since the first visit of Metaxakis to the United States in the summer of 1918. During the intense ecclesiastical upheaval, Alexander sent out an encyclical to the faithful in America on February 26, 1921, stating that he would recognize only the ecumenical patriarchate as his authority until such a time that the ecclesiastical situation in Greece was resolved. Metaxakis, now finding himself in America, maintained that he was still the canonical metropolitan of Athens, but used this opportunity to continue organizing the Greek Orthodox community. During this time, he made monumental steps in the organization of communities, including the official legal incorporation of the Archdiocese of North and South America in the state of New York on September 17, 1921. Moreover, he convoked the first Clergy Laity Congress in the same month, thus instituting a manner in which administrative issues affecting communities across the country could be addressed. Indeed, as the Latin saying goes, audentes fortuna iuvat, fortune favors the bold. On November 25, 1921, Metaxakis was elected ecumenical patriarch, becoming Meletios IV, and thus completely changing the dynamic of the ecclesiastical situation. Although there was sincere debate both in Greece and among elements of the Phonar as to whether Meletios could ascend the patriarchal throne, he nevertheless arrived in Constantinople in February of 1922 and was enthroned as ecumenical patriarch. Immediately, he began to address the issue of the communities in the diaspora. On March 1, 1922, Meletios, along with the Holy and Sacred Synod, issued a decision revoking the Tomos of 1908, thus bringing back all the communities in the diaspora under the direct auspices of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. This would pave the way for the establishment of several new eparchies, including the Holy and Sacred Synod's decision to establish the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America on May 17, 1922. Likewise, on the same day, the Synod held the election for Archbishop of North and South America. The triprosopon, or the three-person ballot, for this position consisted of Bishop Alexander of Rodostolu, Metropolitan Photios of Irinoupoleos, and Archimandrite Kalinikos Dilbei. Even though the Archdiocese would still encounter serious threats to its unity until the 1930s, the arduous work commenced by Ecumenical Patriarch Meletios would lay the foundation for the future stabilization of the Archdiocese. Metaxakis, however, would have a short tenure as Ecumenical Patriarch, as he would resign and be forced into exile at the end of 1923. Nonetheless, in his short tenure as Ecumenical Patriarch, he contributed to many positive and oftentimes provocative initiatives. Most notably, he convoked the Pan-Orthodox Congress of 1923, which deliberated the issues of the calendar, second marriage of the clergy, the church and the diaspora, the relations with the Anglican Church, and yet all of these topics remain topics of deliberation to this day. Whatever one may think of Meletios Metaxakis' vision for the Church, his tenacity for the organization of the Greek Orthodox communities in America, his fierce defense for a church independent from state influence, and his numerous other accomplishments which have produced good fruits for the Church should at the very least garner him our admiration, and perhaps even the epithet magnificent. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Bartholomew. Father Patrick will be next, so you could cue up his PowerPoint. But while that's happening, if there are any clarifying questions, something you weren't sure about?
So we know if Meletios was invited to come to America, or he just came to America after being removed from being metropolitan of Athens.
You know, from what I've seen, at least whatever I could see in the archives, it does not seem like he was. My question would be, like, invited by whom?
Yeah, in other words, did Alexander dial him up and say, come on over here, or did he just need a place of refuge?
In the archives, because most of my material came from the archives, and I'm eternally grateful to Mr. Menios Papadimitriou for his help, I haven't seen anything, but perhaps Menio?
I would add that when Metaxakis came to America, this was one stop. He was doing kind of a tour of all the Western Orthodox presences. He would stop in Paris, the United Kingdom, and America. And when he returned,
Second visit or the first visit?
I think both, because he was
Both.
as far as what I've seen, he was in communication with heavily with Anglican clergy and various British delegates.
Even on his trip to the
So it was
Famar,
kind
he
of
stopped.
this. It seemed to be that it wasn't simply a tour of American Orthodox presence so much as it is a tour of Western Orthodox presences, as I have seen it in the primary sources.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Again, keep them brief at this point.
Father, was there any recent precedents for a member of another autocephalous church to ascend the patriarchal throne?
I don't think that this is necessarily covered under the clarifying questions, but I can definitely answer that later.
Oh.
Yeah, okay. There you go. Okay, so our next speaker is going to be Father Patrick Viscuzzo. We're actually going to be jumping ahead in time from the origins of the Archdiocese and things like that to somewhat more contemporary, more recent history. So, Father Patrick.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I am a canonist of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. I've served other jurisdictions as well. And some people characterize canon law as the bad side of the good news. I don't know if you've ever heard that before. I am, the nature of my reflections today are not historical as the other reflections that have been shared. They are not about the history of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. I'm dealing with a very real present that we're contending with as a minority religion in an overwhelming Protestant, Catholic, whatever have you, environment that we're faced with in the United States. Today I'd like to talk about some reflections that I have on the ordination and consecrated priesthood, the nitty-gritty of the priest's salary, the relationship between lower clergy and the priesthood of the hierarchy, priesthood and authority at the parish level, and finally, a brief canonical analysis of the significance of litigation being brought against the church, which is an increasing phenomena that we find in the United States. Just a word, the words canon law are sort of deceiving. We seem to concentrate on the word law, which is really kind of an invention of our English language when we describe what canon is. Canons, I think, are best described as standards. It's a tool of measurement for thought and behavior. I think they're best described as the application of dogma to historical reality. They're fundamentally incarnational, and in that way they have relevance or irrelevance, as the case might be. Let's talk about ordination a bit. Throughout the Orthodox Church, ordination is regarded as the consecration of an ordinand's entire life to the ministry of Christ. For this reason, you have this main prayer in the ordination ceremony. Be favorably pleased to grant unto him the great grace of thy Holy Spirit, and make him wholly thy servant. Once ordained, the canons governing clergy, particularly those regarding priests, emphasize this idea of sacred vessel. They are models of behavior for their parishes, and these canons are stricter than those for the laity for this reason. Given these differences between clergy and laity in terms of this modeling role, the earliest collections of canons up to the present have neatly divided, and canonical writings have neatly divided themselves into two main parts according to the requirements for clergy and laity. To give you a few obvious examples, the canons that for clergy or candidates for the priesthood and their spouses are much stricter with regard to marriage. Candidates for the priesthood could not be involved in any fornication or adultery in order to be married and ordained, and that includes their spouses. Candidates for ordination, their spouses could not have been married before. Unlike the laity, candidates for priesthood are not permitted to marry those outside of the Orthodox Church, even if they're baptized in the name of the Holy Trinity. And I'd like to emphasize that the Byzantines viewed, quote, our mystery, baptism, as being able to be celebrated outside the confines of the institutional church by those who thought differently than the church, namely those who would be regarded as heretics or schismatics, in other words, the heterodox. Unlike a secular employment, a job or a career, such requirements for purity, as I would describe it, reflect the complete consecration of the priest as a sacred skevos, as a vessel for the parting of sanctification to the faithful through the celebration of the holy mysteries. Such strict requirements, as I'm talking about, reflect a lifelong submission and obedience to the canons that set forth the standards of a life of a consecrated priesthood, which models the church's teachings for the laity. In this connection, the canons use another word for describing the priesthood, and this is the word schema, which at once describes a form or a figure or a shape, nearly in appearance, but also a way of life. Within this context, the canons describe schema as a clerical dress or outward appointment or outward appearance, and the life of the consecrated priesthood in general. In that context, how do we describe salary? Well, the present documents that are accepted as canonical documents, and I refer to the Charter of the Archdiocese and the regulations of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese that implement it, certainly use these words salary and remuneration or compensation, but what does that mean? Does that mean, in fact, that the clergy are being compensated for the ministry of Christ, that they are being paid to consecrate the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ? I would put it to you that the canons do not have that as a description of what is provided to the clergy. They are, in fact, provided a livelihood, according to the canonical text that I read, that it's a livelihood that's provided out of the donations of the faithful and the revenues that are derived from church properties, endowments, and are not, in fact, a salary or a remuneration or a compensation. These points are emphasized in Article 17, Section 8 of the regulations of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, where the standards are set for providing a livelihood for the priest. In these regulations, the standards, and this is an interesting thing to note, the standards that for a priest's livelihood are completely unrelated to specific services rendered or a listing of job responsibilities. The ministry of the priesthood, in this sense, is not purchased, nor should it be the subject of a service contract with a parish, unlike some of the precedent that we've been discussing this morning with priests coming from various places in the early history of the Archdiocese and offering their services as an exchange of goods for remuneration. Now, given this, the priesthood, in this sense, canonically speaking, is not independently held as a basis for compensation, but rather, I would put it to you, according to the canonical texts, is an extension of the office of bishop. At least this is what the official guidance of the Archdiocese puts forth. I have here a text that's commonly distributed to parish councils, and I draw your attention to particularly the last line. The proistomenos, namely the presiding priest, is an extension of the office of the metropolitan and archbishop and never should be thought of as an employee of the parish. As an extension of the office of the bishop, the parish priest canonically exercises the priesthood of the bishop and holds no priesthood independent of the bishop, or so it seems. As exercising the priesthood of the bishop, the parish priest or presbyter must always have the bishop's blessing or permission to exercise the ministry, including his initial and continued assignment to the parish, which also includes his celebration of the mysteries and other functions of the ministry. Nevertheless, it is natural for the priest to appear to function as the head of an assembly with authority in his own right, in his own eyes and in the eyes of the congregation. The church is careful to maintain, I believe, a close dependence of the clergy upon the bishop to avoid this confusion which would affect the unity of the church as a whole. This is, in fact, reflected in Apostolic Canon 39. Let the presbyters and deacons perform, which is the text here, which you obviously cannot see, but I can read to you. Let the presbyters and deacons perform nothing without the consent of the bishop, for he is the one who has been entrusted with the people of God, and who an account will be demanded of him for their souls. Now, interestingly enough, Theodore Balsamon, the famous 12th century canonist, who provided a commentary on the formal corpus of the 770 canons of our church that are commonly accepted, he has something interesting to say about this, while acknowledging that, in fact, the priest should not perform anything without the consent of the bishop. He says, but say that they do not have permission to do whatsoever belongs to the bishop without his consent. Namely, he can do things that do not belong to the bishop without the blessing of the bishop, but for those things that belong to the bishop, he must ask his consent. But then he says something very interesting. What did he highlight as something belonging to the bishop? And immediately he goes to a property question rather than a spiritual question. So I think this is a very interesting point in that it speaks to the authority within the church as it relates to spiritual and material. And I'll return to that in just a moment. So, although in the immediate post-apostolic period, the bishop was no longer the sole presider over Eucharistic assemblies, within the canonical framework developed between the 4th to the 8th century, his authoritative presence at each assembly was still considered the norm, and no assembly could take place without his consent and approval. Consequently, as reflected in the complete dependence on the bishop to exercise priestly ministry, the priest is unable to celebrate the divine liturgy unless doing so with an undimension with the bishop's signs and issues. The priest receives chrism, necessary for any baptism to take place, exclusively from his bishop, which symbolizes episcopal authority and the dependency of the priest on the bishop's blessing for all ministries in the parish. In addition, the parish is required to maintain a permanent throne for their bishop in or adjacent to the altar, on which is displayed Christ the archpriest in episcopal robes, which is incensed and venerated during all services, even in the bishop's physical absence, an exclusive right of each bishop in his ecclesiastical territory. During the divine liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, as celebrated in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, and I must emphasize as celebrated in our Archdiocese, since we seem to abbreviate it, the priest is also required to commemorate his bishop's name not once but 3 times. The episcopal throne and the commemorations are signs not only of the bishop's presence, but I put it to you, of the fact that his blessing or permission is required for the Eucharistic community to be a legitimate Eucharistic community. The bishop, in this way, the horizontal nature of the local bishop's unity with the rest of the episcopate is symbolized at the same time as his vertical unity with the particular Eucharistic community or parish takes place, reflecting the unity of the church as a whole. The bishop is the true pastor of each parish, which cannot have a life of its own apart from the hierarchical authority of the church, or so it would seem. This can be viewed as a corrective to the Congregationalist Eucharistic ecclesiology, and maybe other ecclesiologies, where the bishop's presence is not required due to an overemphasis on the fullness of the church identified with the Eucharistic assembly, namely, wherever the Eucharist is, there is the church. According to which, the parish in itself would be considered complete and Catholic with no regard to episcopal authority. As we stated, all ecclesiastical matters are placed under the bishop's care, who is charged with the care of the faithful and will be called upon to give an accounting to God. The bishop's authority over ecclesiastical matters include not only matters of liturgy and theology, but also, as I alluded to, the goods of the church, its material well-being, and property. Such provisions are repeated consistently in the legislation of the Holy Apostles, as well as the local and ecumenical councils. When steps are taken to correct abuse, such as in the case of Chalcedon Canon 26, where the appointment of an economos or steward is provided to assure proper administration of goods, the affirmation takes place that the bishop's authority remains but is shared or delegated without diminishment of his ultimate responsibility. While the canons address presbyteral misuse of church goods, the laity is not addressed in the same manner. When the canons do address the laity, the point is made to exclude them from exercising separate authority. For example, Canon 12 of the Second Ecumenical Council in Nicaea, quote, "If any bishop or any abbot be found disposing of the episcopate's or monastery's property into the hands of lay rulers or surrendering them to any other person, the transfer is to be invalid and void." The consistent theme that emerges from a canonical analysis is that the bishop has responsible over the material and spiritual goods of his local church as a right of his office. He shares his authority and responsibility, but only by delegation. On the parish level, there is thus canonical recognition of not two authorities, but of delegated responsibilities from the hierarch to the lower clergy and the laity, working together to fulfill the functions and goals of the parish as ministry and service to the church. Consequently, contradictions between two levels of the church's canonical life in its hierarchical ordering and parish structures arise when misunderstandings of the very goals and purposes of the service to the church occur, but not when the service is understood as a ministry guided within the hierarchical order. To go to something that's kind of contemporary, we have this statement that was issued by Sebastianos Skordalos, His Grace Sebastianos Skordalos, Bishop of Zela and Secretary of the Holy Eparchial Synod of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, in a small essay entitled "The Shared Ministry of Clergy and Laity." What I think is very interesting about this point, very small type, obviously, is that he describes a misconception amongst parish clergy, about parish council members, that their role is confined to the material aspects of upkeep of the parish, where he says, very interestingly at the end, that both clergy and laity need to realize that they have a spiritual role to fulfill and that they need to assist in building up the body of Christ. Namely, that the parish clergy and the laity in general in the parish, all have a spiritual aspect to what they're doing, that they actually have to be part and parcel of the ministry of Christ, and not just to keep the lights on the iconostasis burning. Canonical disorder is a problem that is anticipated by the regulations of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese that usually attempt to provide corrective measures to be taken through actions by local bishops, such as the replacement and appointment of new parish council members, and the most extreme in rare cases, a declaration of a parish as being in canonical disorder. In the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, although the parish holds title to all of its real estate and personal property in its corporate name, in the event of a declaration of canonical disorder, such as heresy, schism, or defection for the Archdiocese, The Archbishop may assume control of parish administration and properties, and title to the properties becomes vested automatically in the Archdiocese. When taken to an extreme, canonical disorder manifested in congregationalism creates the potential for a division of the ordained from the unordained by establishing an exclusive lay authority over so-called material affairs. A viewpoint that would create such mutually exclusive authorities calls into question the Church as an incarnational reality by artificially creating and dividing so-called spiritual from material aspects of parish life. The danger of such a view is the confining of sanctification strictly to sacramental acts conducted by the lower clergy, who are employed by a lay leadership, and the development of the notion that the reception of the Eucharist or any other mystery is a commodity rather than an expression of an ecclesiastical reality. The correction to this problem can be made by the affirmation that to serve on the parish council or any other position in the parish is a ministry, and all those who serve are called to represent Christ and the Orthodox faith to all whom they meet in all aspects of life. The ministry of the parish is collaborative, involves the entire community, as expressed in the term syndiaconia. So, let's see. I will skip the intricacies of the regulations of the Archdiocese and the affirmation of what I've been saying in Apostolic Canon 38 and 41, and get right to an interesting point about litigation against a hierarch. Yes, and I will do it quickly. The litigation against the hierarch brings up a rather interesting point, and it can be summarized in a couple of short words, which I think I need to do. In the first place, it represents a secularization of the church. It substitutes, when an ecclesiastical matter is brought to the civil courts, it substitutes the judgment of the hierarchy who are exercising the apostolic ministry when meeting in synod. It substitutes their judgment for a secular judge. It substitutes the canons for civil law. So it asserts that, in fact, the church can be viewed on an ecclesiastical matter as a completely legal and civil organization. And in that way, I think it ultimately denies the incarnational nature of the church. I think we're talking about a faith issue here. The most outstanding example I could put forth is the lawsuit that was brought against His Eminence Archbishop Demetrius and the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. Spiridon?
Yeah, OCL was against Spiridon.
Well, let's see. The plaintiffs bring this action for declaratory and injunction relief to protect their rights as members of the defendant, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North America.
You're right. It's related to the charter.
Yes, it was. It was the charter. I'm sorry.
That's my mistake.
Yeah, that's okay. This was a purely ecclesiastical matter. It dealt with a lawsuit that was brought about a canonical document, the charter, issued by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. It was an attempt to bring into the civil courts the solution of an ecclesiastical matter on the basis of purely legal criteria. It's interesting that the court affirmed, I think, what the church would have affirmed. Although plaintiffs have standing and although the action is not mute and does not merely seek an advisory opinion, it must be dismissed because it involves a question of internal governance of a hierarchical church. On the basis of the very charter on which the plaintiffs rely, they cannot successfully dispute that the Greek Orthodox Church is hierarchical. And while it may appear that the neutral principles of law may be applied to decide whether the defendant's 1977 charter was properly amended, pursuant to Article 24 thereof, if this case were to proceed further, a trial court would ultimately be required to decide whether the ecumenical patriarch had authority to unilaterally to grant a charter to defendant in 2003, clearly a religious matter. So just two short words of conclusion. In my presentation today, I've reflected on priesthood, hierarchy, and parish in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America from a canonical point of view. As the faithful of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America, we exist as a religious minority in North America faced with different models of church that can influence thinking regarding governance, priesthood, hierarchy, and parish life. One of the great dangers is the viewpoint that would divide so-called spiritual from material aspects of parish life and create mutually exclusive authorities by confining clergy to the spiritual and laity to the material. Such a view calls into question the church as an incarnational reality. This mistaken perspective confines sanctification strictly to sacramental acts conducted by the clergy, and also implies that the reception of the Eucharist or any other mystery is a commodity rather than an expression of ecclesial reality. Opposed to this perspective is an icon of the church that involves the entire community and is expressed in the term syndiakonia, where those who serve are called to represent Christ in the Orthodox Church to all whom they meet in all aspects of life. From this canonical viewpoint, the governance and ministry of the parish in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese is a collaboration within the hierarchical ordering of the church. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, just a quick, yeah.
Clarification, Father Patrick, you said, I thought that we commemorate local bishops 3 times in the sacraments. I'm confused. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, do you pray for them in your petitions?
Yes.
You say in Brotis Nistificaria. So when you do commemorate them in the petitions, you're
So I think the question is, what's the third time?
oh, the third time? Do you do them twice in the petitions and once in the Brotis Nistificaria? So it's 1, 2, 3, right?
I thought only in the Great Litany, but how about the other sacraments? So,
Usually once.
yeah, usually it's once.
It's usually just once.
Generally, yeah, I was talking
Okay,
about the
all right, well, we can,
Okay.
we could go through the text and find that out, where the, yeah, anyways.
I'd be glad to. You know, what strikes me is and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Inconsistency is not a bad thing in terms
You can use mine.
of liturgical practice and canonical practice in Orthodoxy, but there are differences in
he
the
said
number
wait.
of commemorations of hierarchy in Slavic
Okay.
churches and in Jewish churches.
Okay. Our final speaker is Father Alkiviadis Kalivas, who's going to talk about the development of the Uniform Parish Regulations. And for those of you standing in the back, the front is empty. Come on down.
Thank you very much, Father Anton and Dr. Skedros. I'm here at the insistence of Dr. Skedros. He says, because of your age, inasmuch as we're discussing the Archdiocese 100 years, you're a good part of that 100 years. Even until a couple of weeks ago, I said to him, I'm not ready to do this. I don't have the stamina or the energy to go research things and I tried to get some information from the archives of the Archdiocese, and to my surprise, there was very little to be found in them with regards to this particular subject that I will be dealing with, and not in great length or in depth as the previous speakers. It's almost like a high school paper. This is really a reflection of a historical moment centered on the Congress, the Clergy Lady Congress of 1964. Sometime in the spring of 1963, well in advance of the 17th Biennial Clergy Lady Congress, scheduled to take place in Denver, Colorado in late June of 1964, His Eminence Archbishop Iakovos gave me a formidable task to draft a series of amendments and additions to the existing Uniform Parish Regulations, the UPR, by which the parishes of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese are organized and administered. The proposed revisions were to be reviewed and adopted by the Archdiocesan Council and then submitted to the Clergy Lady Congress in Denver for final approval. The purpose of the revisions was to give greater clarity to the churchly character and nature of the local parish, or as was always referred to up to the 60s and 70s, ikinotis, the Greek community, or the community of Saint so-and-so. The Archdiocesan Council, after due consideration, approved a final draft of the revisions, which, if I remember correctly, Father Leonidas Kontos edited to make it into better English. And it was brought before the Congress for approval, which it gave, and the Archbishop submitted this to the Ecumenical Patriarchate for approval, ratification. And the ratification became effective in January 1st, 1965. The newly ratified regulations were published and distributed to the parishes of the Archdiocese in 1965. A brief foreword by Archbishop Iakovos introduced the text, which was followed by a preamble, which had a brief introduction and quoted 2 paragraphs from the preamble that appeared in the historic special regulations of the Archdiocese of America, which were adopted at the 4th General Assembly, or Congress, as we would call it now, of the Archdiocese in November of 1931. The short foreword to the revised UPR reads as follows. The within regulations for the parishes of the Greek Orthodox Diocese of North and South America are the product of a long process of refinement and revision, which began in November 1931, when the first Clergy Lady Congress, really the 4th, had convened in New York City, adopted a set of bylaws for the uniform administration of the existing communities. The said bylaws were amended and revised in subsequent Congresses and remained in full force and effect until the 17th Biennial Congress in Denver, Colorado, when the within regulations were adopted during the week of June 28, 1964 to July 3, 1964. The within regulations have been duly ratified by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and they apply uniformly to all the parishes of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America, effective January 1st, 1965. Let me read again a portion of this forward. That what was presented in 1931 remained in full force and effective until the 17th Biennial Congress in Denver. It means, if I interpret it correctly, that there is a change, evidently a radical change, in a portion of the 1931 first uniform regulations. Now, of equal importance are the two paragraphs from the preamble of 1931, the special regulations, which succinctly set forth the purposes for which the regulations exist. The full text of the preamble in the 1964 UPR reads as follows. At the time of the adoption of the initial uniform parish bylaws at the first, actually the fourth, Clergy Laity Congress in November 1931 in New York City, there was approved a preamble to be appended thereto, which faithfully suggested the spirit and intent of the Congress and its participating delegates. Though a full generation has elapsed, and notwithstanding the profound changes that have taken place in the life of our church during the intervening 33 years, the same spirit and the like intent prevailed amongst the assembled lay and clerical representatives who adopted the within regulations at the 17th Biennial Congress in Denver, Colorado. The following excerpts taken from the preamble to the original Uniform Bylaws of 1931 become a fitting preamble to the within regulations. And these are the two paragraphs. We who have been baptized in the name of the Holy Trinity, members of the Eastern Orthodox Church of Christ, the Eastern Orthodox Church of Christ, Anatoliki Orthodoxos Ecclesia, which is built upon his precious blood, holding firmly to the conviction that the Orthodox Church is Christ himself, extending his life on earth and in history, have come together to adopt these present uniform bylaws, that with their help we may order our ecclesiastical life in keeping with the doctrine and tradition of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. We deem the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese in America to be the safekeeper and teacher of the eternal words of faith and the pure source of redemptive power. In her, according to the Lord's unfailing promise, the Holy Spirit abides, leading her to all truths. It is this very truth that prompts us to compose these present bylaws, to preserve us in governing ourselves from errors that would contravene the doctrine of our church. From these lofty words in the preamble, we are able to discern the nature, purpose, and mission of the church and the characteristics that define the devout and faithful people who are members of her body. We learn that church membership is more than a casual relationship based on ethnic identity or social needs, significant as these things are. That it is more than a financial transaction, important as the financial support of the church's ministries is. Church membership depends first and last on one's adherence to the faith of the church and on sacramental communion, because the church is not just an ethnic, social, cultural, benevolent, or political association, but a baptismal and Eucharistic organism formed and quickened from above. canons, charters, regulations, and the various forms of church governance, organization, and administrative structures exist for the good of the church and for the good of her members. Good order prospers where faith abounds and where the members of the body are mindful of the true nature of the church and appreciate her spiritual heritage and riches of her tradition. Good order thrives when the clergy and the laity extend mutual support to one another, are accountable to one another, and acknowledge the prerogatives and responsibilities of one another. Good order flourishes when all the members of the parish work harmoniously with one another under the leadership provided by the parish clergy, particularly by the bishop, who is the head of the local church, the diocese, metropolis, or archdiocese. The church is more than a human society and more than an earthly institution. She is the body of Christ. Since the church is the body of Christ, she is as Christ is, both divine and human. Thus, in spite of the stress and the imperfections of her historical existence, the church is nevertheless a sacramental body, that is a visible entity, a frail people that is simultaneously an organism of divine grace. The church is a living and dynamic organism in which all her members, clergy and laity, are consecrated and equipped for sacred action through their different ministries and diverse gifts and activities. In reality, however, because of human weaknesses and the cares of the world that overwhelm us, many within the body neglect the gifts bestowed upon them. For this and other reasons, the church must be always in a constant mode of evangelization. The clergy and the laity together constitute the people of God, of which they are equal members, with different but interdependent ministries. The laity cannot exist without the ministry of the clergy, nor does the clergy possess any individual power superior to or apart from the laity. Every act of the clergy is performed not for the people, but also with the people, because no order or person stands apart from the church. The clergy are set apart by ordination to exercise the ministry of servant leadership, which above all is characterized by the gift of solicitude, the all-embracing and passionate concern and love of the clergy for the people. The ministry of servant leadership also requires the responsible exercise of authority with wisdom, humility, and love, lest it transmutes into domination, into the need to control and manipulate. Priestly authority is not a personal possession. It is a gift from God and is spiritual in nature. It is a form of service and not a system of rights, privileges, and prerogatives. Priestly authority exists to serve God's plan for the salvation of the world, to serve God's people for the building of unity and communion in anticipation of God's kingdom, which is to come in glory. The church has four orders constitutive of her being: the episcopate, the presbyterate, the diaconate, and the laity, the people. Thus, lay people who profess the Orthodox faith and share the sacramental life of the church have both the right and the obligation to help the clergy advance the church's sacred mission. In exercising these privileges, the lay people bring to the task the personal gifts and talents with which they have been endowed, as well as the knowledge and the experience, the expertise, the specialties, the occupations, and the professions they have acquired through schooling and life experiences, all of which can contribute to the well-being and growth of the church. The work of the church can be seriously impeded when the spirit of cooperation between clergy and the people is compromised and the harmonious relationship between them is broken, knowingly or unknowingly. Some people, clergy and laity alike, see the church solely from an institutional perspective as a human organization. For these people, power and influence are the all-important factors. Consequently, authority is equated with domination. Left unchecked, such attitudes lead to two dangerous extremes in church life: clericalism and laicism, neither of which is compatible with the teachings, the canons, and the ethos of the Orthodox Church. They lead to congregationalism and parochialism. Canons and charters, regulations, and the various forms of church governance and administrative structures exist for the good of the church and her members. Good order prospers where faith abounds and where the members of the body are mindful of the true nature of the church.
Paper's got it for you.
That's all right.
You're there.
Just let me begin here. The beginnings of the Orthodox parish in America was succinctly described by Archbishop Iakvos in one of his keynote addresses. Our parishes in America, he said, began as organizations and developed into religious communities. Today they are churches. Around them our whole life is entwined and is developed. It was exactly this reality that the 1964 Uniform Parish Regulations sought to incorporate in the proposed amendments and additions to the UPR. In the United States and throughout the Western Hemisphere, in the early days of immigration, lay people, as we heard already, established most, if not all, of the parishes, often without the help or supervision of the clergy. Moreover, the founders of these parishes, though devout and well-intentioned, were not schooled in Orthodox ecclesiology. Parishes were established chiefly as ethnic enclaves and societies, with power structures and institutions that resembled local villages of the members' countries of origin. Very often, the models of community governance were borrowed from secular organizations or from other religious groups in America, in which the spirit of congregationalism prevailed, and boards of trustees or boards of directors, compromising solely of lay people, exercised ultimate authority over the affairs of the community. The early immigrants organized themselves into self-sustaining, independent ethnic societies and associations in order to preserve and transmit to later generations their cherished ethnic identities, language, customs, and traditions, their treasured ethos and values. For most of the early immigrants, among their valued treasures was their Orthodox faith and church. And so these same societies and organizations also founded churches and engaged clergy from abroad or from among the few local itinerant clerics of strange backgrounds and questionable character to tend to the spiritual needs of their members and impart their treasured traditions and values to their posterity. Historically, therefore, the ethnic immigrant organizations preceded the establishment of the Orthodox parish, which was viewed essentially as a social or ethnic unit and organization, a religious corporation whose ultimate authority was exercised by the people through their elected officials, the Board of Trustees, who exercise full control over the affairs of the parish, determine its goals and objectives, oversee its finances, programs, and personnel, among which are the clergy and trustees who zealously protect the independence of the parish. Let me skip here a minute. We heard about the Charter of 1921, which established the Archdiocese, the new Charter of 1927, and then the third Charter of 1931. A strong, independent, congregationalist spirit carried over from the earlier secular beginnings as an ethnic community prevailed in the parish. Even its chief administrative body, which held sway over the affairs of the community, was called the Kitikon Simvulion, Board of Directors or Board of Trustees, and its lay presiding officer the most powerful and influential figure in the community. And while the local church community was called a parish in the English version of the UPR, the Greek text referred to it as community, kinotis, hardly ever as enoria or parikia. The priest, according to the bylaws, was assigned the role of counselor and advisor to the Board of Trustees and the General Assemblies, and was obliged, quote, in every matter and at all times to cooperate fully with the trustees of the parish. For sure, in this sense, he was not the servant leader of the local community, but one of its employees, restricted mostly to liturgical duties and beholden to the trustees and benefactors for his livelihood. One of the purposes of the 1964 regulations was to help remedy this situation together with the prevailing spirit of congregationalism and parochialism. At this point, I'll stop. I think I'm over my time, but we can distribute these bylaws from two sources. The 1962 Clergy Laity Congress, which was the last Congress to amend the original bylaws established for the first time, the Uniform Parish bylaws for the first time in 1931. That is in the left column. In the right column, you will find certain articles from the 1964 Clergy Laity Congress. The amendments which were proposed and which I helped create indicate more clearly that the church now is moving towards a more churchly identity and overcoming congregationalism and parochialism. And perhaps after you view that, we may at some point discuss these changes.
Thank you, Father. Thank you, Father. Quick question, yeah.
So Father, in the answer to your question about the commemoration of the Hierarch, come over here. pointed out, the great snuffy, the litany of peace. Then the one thing you probably skip, which a lot of priests do, fervent supplication, which is right before the catechism prayers. And then the other part is then the post-anaphora commemoration of the hierarchy. So they, just so you know, and I'm sure you already realize, Slavic churches do this, commemorate more than that. Even the Carpatho-Russians, who have kind of a different sort of liturgical tradition, we would regard as, well, thank you. We would regard as sort of abbreviated, but I don't think they do that. They don't believe it is abbreviated. They, I believe, commemorate, I think they do it 5 times, if I'm not mistaken.
You can never
But I just
commemorate
wanted
too
to-
many times.
But yeah, that's right.
Is there time for questions?
Yeah, we're playing with the clock here, so we'll have a little time, and we do want to open it up to any. Yeah.
I have a very quick informational question that everyone seems to know the answer to except me. Why did the 1908? Oh, that's all right.
It's for the
Why
live
did the-
stream.
Oh.
Sorry, you're on the air.
Did
You're on the
19
air.
Okay, I got it. Why did the 1908 decision to go from the Patriarchate to the Church of Greece happen? What was, because everyone seems to, that was, so then I missed it. Could you explain that again? What was the logic of that decision?
The logic isn't to be found in church policy as much as it is the church's place in a larger political context in which it was confronted by intimidation and threats by its host government, the Ottoman Empire, under the very brutal rule of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. The Patriarchate faced threats of violence and expropriation against it because of the activities of clergy in the United States, Greek Orthodox clergy. The Patriarchate was forced to distance itself from the clergy to not be held accountable for their actions. The strategy they set upon was one that, in effect, transferred the dormant authority of the Patriarchate of Constantinople over the church in the New World to a caretaker, if you will, authority in the form of the Church of Greece.
Great, thank you. I missed that. Thanks.
Can I just add one more? There was published in 1908 in Chicago a poster in Greek and English on the expected great uprising, and in this poster is an image of Hagia Sophia in the background, the heads of European leaders and American and the government of the U.S., the president of the U.S., and the King of Greece, etc. And this is published in America in 1908, basically saying that we're ready to get Constantinople. And so therefore it kind of leads into exactly what you were just saying, in the sense that the Turkish government is catching wind of this and putting pressure on the Patriarchate. And because you would think, why are Greeks in America interested in this? Very much interested in it. As we know, they're going to go back and fight in the Balkan Wars anyway, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Jim. Just as follow-up, 1908 was a crucial year for the Balkans and the Ottoman Empire specifically. It was a period of abject chaos in the empire. 1908 was the year of the Young Turk Revolution. As Dr. Skedros just pointed out, the Ottomans for some time, throughout the preceding century, had been confronted with nationalist movements that aimed to liberate peoples from Ottoman rule. The primary focus of the Ottoman Empire was on, in terms of the church in the United States, was on diaspora activist priests who were outspoken advocates of irredentism, and yes, ultimately, in romanticized terms, the recapture, if you will, liberation of the Ottoman Empire and restoration of Hagia Sophia. And so the decision is motivated almost entirely by political calculation created by conditions of chaos in the Ottoman Empire, what the Ottomans perceive as threats to their territorial integrity and national security, and international and diplomatic considerations and forces.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. I know Father Patrick has a question for.
Yeah, I have a question for Dr. Kiru and Dr. Skedros. We see the other great, could we apply this phrase to the Greek Orthodox Church in the United States prior to 1923, the absence of hierarchy? And do we not have a kind of a contrast with the Roman Catholic Church, particularly I'm thinking of John Carroll, one of the founding fathers, who acts to ensure the hierarchical ordering of the Catholic Church? Is there not a contrast to what goes on with the Orthodox Church in this country, both the Greek Orthodox churches and the Slavic churches?
Father Patrick, you've raised a fascinating question. You spoke to me about this earlier as a project of research that you're currently involved in. I'd like you to return to it to share with us some of your initial findings. I think your characterization is a perfect one. It captures the condition and reality of the initial, certainly the pioneer churches in the United States, where, as I stated, they were essentially Congregationalist, independent undertakings. Father Kalivas talked about the consequences of that historical experience on the body of the church and its condition even after the establishment of a hierarchical church subsequent to 1922. So this is an issue that continues to resonate even at this point when we commemorate the centennial of the establishment of the Archdiocese. It is part of the historical legacy of the, I'd say first Greek and then Greek Orthodox experience in America. Dr. Skedros?
No, just I would concur.
I'd also like to highlight the research done on this subject by Father Nicholas Ferenc, who has done extensive research into the position of John Carroll in ensuring that the Roman Catholic Church continued in its hierarchical ordering, despite the Protestant orientation of American civil law, particularly regarding religious incorporations.
Professor Kitroev, yeah. Yeah, Demolak, you can run. Yeah, he's running over. Yeah.
Thank you. One of the things that's come out very clearly in Greece during the commemorations of the Asia Minor disaster, the centenary, is the horrific extent of the so-called national schism that we knew about. We knew about this polarization between Venizelists and Royalists. But the details and the additional information coming out, both of the intensity, depth, and goriness of the division, and the extent to which it influenced the entire society of Hellenism and the diaspora are kind of quite remarkable. Yeah. And in that sense, reflecting on the three presentations on the early history of the church, I'm kind of thinking, is the glass half empty or half full, as it were? Because what was achieved was quite remarkable. I remember reading in the archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Greek ambassador to Washington, Simopoulos, informs Athens, it's not the churches that are choosing between Venizelists and Royalists, it's the lay members who are imposing their political beliefs on the particular priest and creating these type of divisions. So in that sense, I think, although everything looked a little bit the way it was wonderfully described in these three presentations, I think the glass is half full. Yeah. And the final thing, Father Kalivas's topic is one that you could almost have a whole day. Yeah. It's fundamental. It's how we get the so-called archiepiscopico modello here. The parish, the enoria, overshadows the community. It doesn't really happen effectively in any other diaspora community and is a huge issue. So thank you for raising that.
Oh, definitely.
For your history of the Archdiocese, your absolute history.
Well, yeah. Well, I want to just thank the panelists for getting us off to this start. Yes, we went off schedule a bit, but that's the way these things go. So, hey, please So thank you very, very much. I'm sure they'll have questions for you over a relatively quick break. And Dr. Skedros is in charge now, so he'll bring you back to order in a few minutes. And thank you all. There's coffee.